For centuries, women have been subordinated to men. And while conditions for women have improved dramatically in many countries in the last century, there are still vestiges of a brutal past where it was the norm for fathers to sell their daughters to their husbands, for men to beat their wives and daughters into submission, and for husbands to use their wives as an object to produce children to work their land and pass down their property. The world today bears all the scars and birthmarks from the old society it came from. And in many ways, the barbarism we've been told only exists in the past never actually went away, but is hidden away from the public eye or become totally ingrained into our everyday lives. I think the most vivid example of this oppression is the prevalence of violence against women. According to the United Nations in 2023, 52% of women and girls over 15 globally were subjected to sexual violence within the last 12 months. 61% of human trafficking victims worldwide were women, and 96% of the ones trafficked for sexual exploitation were women. And aside from sexual exploitation, women are trafficked in large numbers for forced domestic labor and marriages. And here in the wealthiest country in the world, the conditions of women are still egregious. The United States accounts for 70% of all femicides in high-income countries. 38% of women in the US have experienced sexual harassment at work. 1 in 7 have changed jobs or quit their job because of a sexual harassment or assault. And 60% of women say that they have experienced unwanted sexual attention, coercion, or just sexist comments in the workplace. Many of these cases are underreported as well because abusers often go without any consequences whatsoever. But the oppression of women does not only exist in the form of sexual violence. We can see this in this subjugation of women in the fact that in the US, women make only 80 cents for every dollar a male worker does. And women make up the majority of the workforce in the lowest paid jobs. Our culture also fixates on women's bodies and pushes an endless amount of cosmetic products, services, and surgeries on them to make them more beautiful and valuable objects, and leads girls to grow up with low self-esteem, depression, and eating disorders. The Center for Mental Health Services found that 90% of those who have eating disorders are women and girls between the ages of 12 and 25. Women's bodies, sexuality, career choices, and more are held to impossibly high social expectations and are often held to a double standard to men. But this fixation on women and their choices and their lives is just a byproduct of women's role in production in class society as a whole. Why is the world like this? How did we get here? And I think most importantly, how can we change this? For the vast majority of history, humans actually lived in egalitarian communistic societies where women were respected equally to men and revered for the important role they played in bearing children and gathering food, which sustained the entire tribe, especially when there was no meat to be hunted. The concepts of private property, wages, and oppression didn't exist. This was not because these early societies were just innately more generous or nice than today's humans, but because this way of living was necessary for their survival. Under this primitive kind of communism, the productive forces, i.e., the means for humans to produce necessities such as food and shelter and clothing, they were not developed enough at this stage to provide for everyone's needs. And this required the entire tribe to have a role in hunting, gathering, and raising children. If an individual took more than their share and refused to contribute, they would alienate themselves from the rest of the group and be left to fend for themselves in the wilderness. It wasn't culture in the abstract that created these positive relations between men and women, but it was actually the reverse. These relations were observed in societies spanning the globe despite having no means of communication with one another. The material conditions made this type of society necessary and laid the basis for the cultural attitudes that would arise from this arrangement. And this is ultimately what characterizes a materialist outlook on the world, whereas an idealist would argue that it's the ideas in society, the language, attitude, inherent values that are the main things that change the world. In his book, Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Friedrich Engels used the anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan's notebooks to scientifically determine and discover how human society developed. And this was incredibly important because anyone who used a materialist approach to science and history at the time was censored and repressed if any of these discoveries could disprove the existence of God and the religious myths about how the world was created. From the very beginning, the struggle between materialism and idealism has been a crucial part of the class struggle. Morgan studied the family structures of various indigenous tribes, discovering that many did not have a nuclear or bourgeois family structure like we do under capitalism. And the ones that had not been in contact with class society held very different attitudes and practices when it came to women, child rearing, and property. And this is proof that women haven't always been an oppressed group in society, and that their oppression must have stemmed from somewhere. And from there, the question arises, if there can be an end to oppression, how can it be achieved? Because some believe that it can't. Many of us have heard the argument that women's oppression has existed for all of human history because, men are larger, they're stronger than women, and therefore they're automatically going to be aggressive and dominating. And women are smaller and weaker, and therefore biologically determined to be more submissive and nurturing. But this argument asserts that it's in men's nature to be aggressive and dismissive to women. But this is overly simplistic. This is an overly simplistic understanding of psychology that's incorrect when you actually study the history of humanity. In the beginning of human existence, men were not the head of the households, and there were no restrictions on the sexual relations on either gender. In Origin of the Family, Engels notes, usually the female portion ruled the house. The stores were common, but woe to the luckless husband or lover who is too shiftless to do his share of the providing. No matter how many children or whatever goods he might have in the house, he might at any time be ordered to pick up his blanket and budge. With the advent of agriculture, humans began to gain more control over their environment, allowing them to produce a surplus for the first time ever. And this surplus became concentrated into the hands of men, who were the main ones growing food when agriculture began to produce more than what they needed. The men that wanted to pass down their tools, livestock, and other property to their male heirs. And this prompted the shift from mother right to father right, where now family lines were traced through the paternal line rather than the maternal line. Engels considered the overthrow of the mother right as the world historic defeat of the female sex. He said, the man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. At this point, monogamy is strictly enforced, but only on the woman, and marriage ties can only be broken by the husband. Slavery also emerged at this time as a result of the newfound ability to produce enough necessities to maintain a slave and several slaves, as well as the desire to pass down as much wealth as possible to the next heir. And so prior to this surplus, group marriage was widely practiced, separating the generations as a natural evolution to prevent incest between parent and child. From there, children of the same mother were next to be excluded from sexual intercourse, pushing family lines to form themselves into gens, where the matrilineal blood relations, which were matrilineal blood relations, meaning traced through the female line. And the increasing level of complexity that family relations developed eventually made group marriage impossible and led to pairing marriages between one man and one woman. Due to the increasing scarcity of available women to reproduce with, the practice of purchasing and capturing women for marriage began to emerge. But Engels explains that these are widespread symptoms of the deeper change that had occurred. Up until this point, the changes in family structure that had naturally taken place over time were for the survival of the species, but would then begin to be caused by class relations. For these reasons, the transition to class society was clearly by no means a peaceful transition from the struggle to survive to freedom and abundance. No way. In volume 1 of Capital, Marx says, capital comes dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. An example of this is the colonization of the Americas. Since the indigenous tribes of the Americas had never been in contact with class society before, when the conquistadors came from Europe, they had trouble convincing the leaders to convert to their way of life because the concepts of money and private property were incompatible with their society. And this inability to assimilate the indigenous people became one of the reasons that they ended up committing genocides and kidnapping children to take them to re-education schools. The transition of the family from purely kinship to a unit of property relations laid the basis for not just the oppression of women, but also the oppression of children and LGBT people, which I unfortunately don't have the time to get into, but I hope comrades come in the discussion with additions on that. The revolutionary idea in Origin of the Family is the fact that through the study of tribes that were not yet in contact with class society, as well as the first class societies like ancient Rome and Greece, Engels not only proved that the oppression of women didn't always exist, but by showing that it's tied to the advent of private property and class society, he clearly proves that the only way to get rid of women's oppression is by fighting for a society without private property and without classes, communism. Engels's ideas are either completely ignored or attacked in every anthropology or sociology textbook you find for this very reason. Their content is revolutionary. Many women who are passionate about fighting for women's oppression would probably describe themselves as feminists. And that's been colloquially understood to mean, for the complete equality of men and women and an end to all forms of gender-based oppression. And all of us would agree that we are fighting for the total emancipation of women. But we also must understand and consider that feminism has an ideology, its own history, its own theory, and class basis that Marxists need to consider as well. The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, which later inspired Betty Friedan's pamphlet, The Feminine Mystique, is known as one of the most influential works of feminist theory. And feminist theory generally tends to correctly point out the different ways in which women's oppression manifests itself in society, but its fundamental flaw is that it's unable to accurately find the root of the oppression and explain how to get rid of it. It's like a doctor that can only tell you what your symptoms are, but not what's causing them or what the cure is. A doctor like this can make very deadly mistakes, like mistaking lung cancer for asthma, and can end up killing their patient no matter how much they wanted to help them. And so it's important to have a materialist understanding in order to fight this oppression. The main argument in The Second Sex is that men have made themselves the subject or the absolute gender and define women as the other or the object. She argues that this otherness is why women are treated as inferior, denying that nature or history can shape these definitions, and says that people must struggle for men and women to mutually recognize each other as subject. The argument that men and women have always been this way is a useful argument for the capitalists, actually. If we believe that our social relations are solely determined by our genetics or human nature, there is no use for fighting for any kind of societal change. Beauvoir exposes this when she admits herself Throughout history, women have always been subordinated to men, and hence their dependency is not the result of a historical event or a social change. It was not something that occurred. The reason why otherness in this case seems to be an absolute is in part that it lacks the contingent or incidental nature of historical facts. A condition brought about at a certain time can be abolished at some other time. As the Negroes of Haiti and others have proved, the workers in the factories, but it might seem that a natural condition is beyond the possibility of change. This is one of the ways that philosophy is used by the ruling class as a seemingly objective cover for reactionary ideas in society, and obscures the class interests behind their argument. This idealist framework of understanding women's oppression has a pernicious role in society, because whether it is coming from someone who claims they are for or against women's liberation, this outlook rejects the idea that women can ever be made equal members of society, and silently justifies the idea that the oppression that women face and the aggressive behavior from men are just natural parts of life. In her book, Beauvoir distorts Engels' ideas in Origin of the Family, saying the woman was not created by the bronze tool alone, and the machine alone will not abolish her. And in order to comprehend that situation, we must look beyond the historical materialism that perceives in man and woman no more than economic units. Feminist theory often argues that all women have the same interests based on their gender. And at first glance, this might make sense. Why would any woman want abortion to be illegal or the wage gap to exist? But Marxists actually disagree with this idea, seeing that from history, working class women and men have more in common with each other than a working woman and a bourgeois woman do. In her attempt to find out why women are not able to unite as one entire block, Beauvoir actually concedes to this point, saying, women have no past, no history or religion of their own. They have no such solidarity of work and interests as that of the proletariat. They're not even herded together in the way that creates community feeling among the American Negroes or the factory hands in Renault. If they belong to the bourgeoisie, they feel solidarity with the men of that class, not with proletarian women. And just to give a real life example of this, the richest woman on the planet is heiress to the Walmart fortune. Her name is Alice Walton, and has a net worth of $101 billion. Do you think Alice Walton would be happy to give the 2.1 million Walmart workers worldwide paid family leave for 1 year, or pay her women workers equal to her male workers? For the capitalists, women are a cheap source of labor that can be used to sow divisions in the working class by making them compete with men for a limited amount of jobs at lower wages overall, and provide unpaid domestic labor that produces the working class, that reproduces the working class. The second richest woman on earth is L'Oreal heiress Françoise Bettencourt Myers, whose net worth is $81.6 billion. And I want to ask, does she have any interest in ending the system that makes women insecure in their own bodies and pressures them to enhance their beauty at any cost, when she rakes in $6 billion a year from her cosmetics conglomerate? No, like, her interests are unequivocally in maintaining the system. These billionaire women can buy their way out of nearly all forms of women's oppression, but working women have no escape. Working women are doubly exploited on the basis of their class and their gender, and things like race and sexuality can also add overlapping layers of oppression that create unique barriers to them. In a district court case called De Graffenried versus General Motors, General Motors claimed that because they hired Black men in factories, they were not discriminating based on race, and that since they hired white women in the offices, they were not discriminating based on gender. And the court dismissed the claims from Black women that were being discriminated against because the court approached the discrimination on the basis of race and gender as separate items. And the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989 to describe how the US court system failed to account for this kind of compound discrimination that Black women experience in the workplace. And while it's true that intersectionality can correctly identify overlapping oppressions and the unique issues they create, Crenshaw's flaw is that she believed that it was the lack of an intersectional framework that caused Black women to fall through the cracks of the court system. If only all the judges in the justice system considered the different points of intersectionality of the people involved, they could have saved them and raised their position in society. But how could it be possible to think of all of these different points of intersectionality for every type of person? This framework attempts to categorize people into ever more categories, but people are not just simple boxes. Every single person is unique in their particular set of characteristics and circumstances, meaning there's an infinite number of intersections that exist. And what this framework does is actually atomize the working class, because as you create more and more specific boxes, the only people you seemingly share a common interest with are those with your specific set of identities. But even if people shared the exact same identity categories, their relation to the means of production, their class, is the main determining factor of their political perspective. Intersectionality treats class as just any other identity, and it buries the real divisions in society. And because the working class needs the broadest possible unity to emancipate itself, intersectionality hampers the movement of oppressed people against the system that keeps them oppressed, capitalism, and class society as a whole. The divisive conclusions of intersectionality and feminism make identity politics the ideal tools of the ruling class. They can ensure that the working class cannot unite against them, and the reactionary nature of them is concealed behind radical sounding language. One of the biggest issues with identity politics is the idea that people who are oppressed for one of their identities can still be an oppressor due to another one, and therefore benefit from that oppression taking place. An example of this would be that Black men are oppressed because of their race, but privileged because of their gender, and therefore benefit from the oppression of women. Instead of clarifying that the capitalists are the real oppressors, the identity politics pits workers against each other while the capitalists get off scot-free. Men should not be seen as allies on the sidelines of a struggle against women's oppression, or excluded because they're seen as the enemies, but as active fighters and comrades alongside the women in a common struggle against the class that oppresses them both. Marxism, because of its materialist analysis of class society, is the only philosophy that can accurately explain the root of oppression and lay out the most effective way to fight it. The Russian Revolution proved this theory in practice, which makes it the most inspiring example of what kind of change is possible for women. It wasn't until 1861 when the emancipation of the serfs in Russia took place, which meant that capitalism didn't really develop in Russia until the 1880s, which was very late compared to the rest of the world. In Tsarist Russia, wife beating was legal and encouraged. Divorce was impossible to obtain without the permission of the husband and the church, and the life expectancy for women was 30 years old. In 1908, a quarter of peasant women aged 45 had been pregnant up to 10 times in their life, and their exhausted bodies caused a quarter of their pregnancies to end in miscarriage. Women were saddled with the burden of child rearing and domestic labor, of which cooking and cleaning was backbreaking work, as most people didn't have access to electricity, especially in the rural areas of Russia. And later in 1914, Russia was drawn into World War I, which was a devastating inter-imperialist war. Because Russia was an extremely backwards, semi-feudal country at the time, it did not have the industry required to produce enough materials for the war effort. Men were often sent to battle with no boots, no rifles, and told to get some off of the nearest corpse that they could find. At home, women were especially hit hard by the war. Not only were they forced to see their sons, brothers, and husbands be thrown into battle to be slaughtered for this imperialist war, the war placed even greater burdens on them, in addition to the domestic labor and child rearing they were doing. In the cities, women entered the workforce and were forced to work for as many as 14 hours a day and half the pay as men. Tens of thousands of children would wander the streets waiting for their mothers to come home. And in rural areas, peasant women suffered the most during this time. They were made to replace the men plowing the fields, but since the horses were also conscripted for the war, the peasant women were also made to pull the heavy wooden plows themselves on their backs instead of the horses. For these reasons, the war was the cause of an immense amount of anger in society. Desperate to feed their families when the rising costs were too high to buy on a woman's wage, working women in Russia looted meat markets and bread shops in 1915. In June of that year, women went on strike, demanding to be given flour. But this was only the beginning of what was to come, of this rising up of the women workers in Russia. Almost 2 years later, on the 28th of February, a revolution ignited. A woman delegate of the tram depot workers had asked the soldiers the night before, "Will you shoot if we march for International Working Women's Day tomorrow?" And they said no. They didn't want to shoot into a crowd of people that looked like their mothers and their sisters and their children. And with that, the next day, women walked out of their factories, out of their homes, and into the streets. They were demanding food and an end to the war. The striking women threw sticks, stones, and snowballs at factory windows, urging their male counterparts to join them. And the crowd grew to 75,000 people, and police were unable to stop them. After that day of protest, the strikers returned to their factories, but instead of going to work, they held meetings, and the stoppages spread until half of the industrial workers of Petrograd were on strike. The workers poured out into the streets, forming a demonstration of 400,000 people who were demanding bread and peace, but also now down with the Tsar as well. And in less than a week, the working class brought down the Romanov dynasty, which is a brutal regime that lasted over 300 years. When the capitalists realized that they could not stop the revolution under the Tsar, they put together the provisional government, and it was a government of the capitalists and landlords. The moderate socialists, like the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, also collaborated with the provisional government. But Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood that the only way to fulfill the needs of the masses was to break with capitalism altogether and establish a workers' government. From April to early July 1917, the Soviets, or workers' councils, held the real power in society, and the provisional government was on very thin ice. The workers went from potential strength in this time to actual strength, and a huge part of that was due to the struggle of the women workers, as well as the leadership of Bolshevik women. After the February Revolution, Vera Slutskaya, who was newly appointed to the executive committee in Petrograd, convinced the party to relaunch the Bolsheviks' women's newspaper. It was called Rabotnitsa, or Women Worker, and leading Bolshevik women such as Inessa Armand, Alexandra Kollontai, and Nadezhda Krupskaya served on the editorial board, along with some working women that were in the party. Rabotnitsa played a vital role in organizing working women, selling over 40,000 copies of each issue. The following months were filled with even more anger and class conflict. In April, the provisional government's promise to the Allies to continue the war to a glorious conclusion was leaked, and it sparked mass protests that forced the two most hated bourgeois ministers to resign. And a month later, on May 1st, the laundresses led by Bolshevik women such as Sofia Goncharskaya, went on strike fighting for the 8-hour working day, better pay, and an end to the body searches that often covered up sexual harassment in the laundries. This was a fierce battle where the management went so far as throwing boiling water at the striking women. And after a month, the employers were forced to pay them back for all the time they were on strike. And this was one of the victories they achieved and reported in Rabotnitsa. A team of women Bolsheviks led by Elena Rozmirovich also led the struggle to organize the soldatki, or the wives of the soldiers in the war, demanding a monthly allowance, an end to the war, and all power to the Soviets, which successfully forced concessions from the provisional government. Continuing, in July, the provisional government began a new military offensive in the war. And when it sparked mass protests, they launched a smear campaign against the Bolsheviks because they were afraid of the potential power that they wielded as a party to mobilize the rest of the working class. Lenin was painted as a German spy and had to go into hiding. Trotsky and Alexandra Kollontai were imprisoned, and the party was outlawed, and its printing presses were destroyed. The only functioning Bolshevik publication at this time was Rabotnitsa, and became the backbone of the party's efforts to organize women before and during the October Revolution. Within days of the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks made history. 4 days after the Bolsheviks came to power, they reduced the working day to 8 hours, which disproportionately improved the lives of the women who had the double burden of working and caring for children in the home. The Soviet government gave women and men equal rights, including the right to vote. And at the time, the only other countries where women had the right to vote were Denmark and Norway. The Soviet Union also became the first place in the world to have legal access to abortion and to legalize homosexuality. Getting married became a simple process that allowed for mutual freedom to divorce, which radically changed the position of women in society. After the revolution, Russia had the highest divorce rate in the world, as thousands of women who were trapped in miserable marriages were finally able to be free and choose the lives that they wanted to lead. The policies of the Bolsheviks were massively supported by the women, and even in a state of civil war, they were given so much freedom that they had never had before. Despite not being conscripted to fight in the Red Army, 70,000 women volunteered to defend the revolution. This was because the women had the most to win if the revolution succeeded and the most to lose if it failed. Alexandra Kollontai was appointed the People's Commissar of Public Welfare, making her the first female minister in the world. And one of her first decrees dealt with maternity and made it so all women were given 16 weeks of paid maternity leave, and the working week of breastfeeding women was restricted to just 4 days. And this was over a century ago. Here in the richest country, 1 in 4 mothers returned to work within 10 days after giving birth, because there is no federally mandated paid family leave. This was only the beginning of the much larger change that needed to take place in order to end the oppression of women completely. The material inequality that reproduces oppression and prejudice had to be addressed, starting with advancing technology and production to meet the material needs of the women and the rest of society. The women's department, established by the Bolsheviks in 1919, was called the Zhenotdel, and its first leader was Inessa Armand. The Zhenotdel immediately began teaching women how to read and write, bringing them into politics, and this doubled the number of women in the party in 10 years. Nurseries, kindergartens, soup kitchens, and public laundries were also built. But the war put a limit on what would actually be achieved in the new worker state. These achievements on the road to women's liberation were not achieved by focusing only on organizing women workers because they were more oppressed, but by the revolutionary struggle of the entire working class. Despite the incredible advances that were made, there were enormous barriers to the building of genuine socialism. In Women and the Family, Trotsky said, the easiest problem was that of assuming power, yet just that problem alone absorbed all of our forces in the early period of the revolution. The Soviet Union was under siege by 21 different armies, putting it in a desperate struggle for survival. And the success of a socialist revolution, and it needed the success of a socialist revolution in an advanced capitalist country like Germany, for instance. But the revolution remained isolated, and the worker state degenerated into a conservative and counter-revolutionary bureaucracy. Under Stalin, many of the gains of the revolution were reversed. In the 1936 family law, abortion was restricted, and in the 1944 family law, it was passed to strengthen the nuclear family and promote having large numbers of children. Women were actually given awards based on how many children they had, and legal as well as monetary restrictions were placed on getting a divorce. The degeneration of the Soviet Union and Stalinism's crimes against women is damning evidence of the falsehood that is the idea of socialism in one country. The material base to get rid of women's oppression couldn't be built in one country alone, let alone one that was devastated by years of civil war and extremely backwards to begin with. Only an international socialist revolution can create the conditions for the complete liberation of women. Capitalism has been restored in Russia, and it is an imperialist country today. In 2017, domestic violence was decriminalized there, and today it has one of the highest gender wage gaps compared to other high-income countries. The conditions of women have been thrown back more than 100 years in Russia. According to a report from the World Economic Forum earlier this year, it will take 134 years to close the global gender wage gap. Capitalism creates wealth and abundance for the few, while it creates abject poverty and artificial scarcity for billions of people. The wealth, technology, and industry created under capitalism lay idle because there is nowhere profitable to put them. Capitalism as a system has nothing to offer women, and it has nothing to offer the working class as a whole. We talked so far about women's oppression, where it came from, how women have fought for communism, but what comes after that? What comes next? What will the new society look like? A workers' government could unleash all of the potential that humanity has to offer and build a world where women and all the oppressed layers in society can lead fulfilling lives, where they can study anything that they wish, they can make art, and live dignified lives free of oppression and exploitation. When it comes to social relations under communism, we can't really predict what exactly it will look like because we've lived under class society for our whole lives, and that influences whatever ideas we have. Engels put it this way. He said, that will be answered when a new generation has grown up, a generation of men who never in their lives have known what it is to buy a woman's surrender with money or any other social instrument of power. A generation of women who have never known what it is to give themselves to a man for any other considerations than real love, or to refuse to give themselves to their lover from fear of economic consequences. When these people are in the world, they will care precious little what anybody today thinks what they ought to do. They will make their own practice and their corresponding public opinion about the practice of each individual, and that will be the end of it. There is no end to women's oppression without an end to class society, which is why if you want to fight for a world free from oppression, the only thing you can be is a communist, a Marxist, and there's no need to qualify that with anything else. The Russian Revolution is a case study in how conditions for women can radically improve in a very short amount of time. But this was an extremely backwards country, even by 1917 standards. The world socialist revolution that the communist generation will build in our lifetimes will go light years ahead of what the Bolsheviks were able to achieve. The working class is the vast majority of society today. The working women of the world will be spurred on by events to fill the streets in revolutionary struggle, whether we are there or not. We would be doing all of the radicalized women in society a disservice if we withhold the tools to fight oppression and capitalism from them. And so it's on us to win them over and unite them with their class brothers and sisters under the banner of communism. Women have been shackled with chains that are thousands of years old, but armed with a materialist understanding of the world, we can do more than tell ourselves to accept the weight of them. We have the power to smash them to pieces and build a society where all of humanity can truly be free.